Hey guys, tonight we are going to wander through the mists of medieval Eastern Europe toward a castle that holds a secret so strange it sounds like something ripped from a very disturbed dream. Imagine, if you will, standing on the edge of a vast dark forest. The air bites at your cheeks, tasting of damp earth and forgotten centuries. Before you, rising out of the swirling fog like a battleship carved from blood-red brick, is a fortress. It's enormous, silent, brooding. And tonight, we're going to step inside its long shadow, or maybe just drift towards it very, very slowly, until the weight of its history starts to feel like a heavy blanket settling over your eyelids. Just a little bedtime story about power, faith, and maybe, just maybe, one of the strangest building materials ever rumored to be used. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Staying awake, I mean. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is as you get ready to drop off. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing there in the damp, chill air. It's quiet, isn't it? Just the distant sigh of the wind through unseen trees, perhaps the whisper of the mist as it curls around your ankles. The castle looms, a solid, unyielding shape against a sky that feels impossibly far away. You can almost feel the sheer weight of it, the density of countless bricks, stones, timbers. It's all piled high by hands that turned to dust 700 years ago. This isn't some fairy tale turreted confection. This is a beast of burden, a practical engine of control and power, designed to intimidate just by existing. Its walls aren't just walls, they're statements. They speak of authority, of unshakable dominance, of a willingness to impose will upon the landscape and the people living on it. Think about traveling here. Back then, no high-speed trains, no instant maps on your phone, not even a decent paved road for hundreds of miles. Just mud, forests that seemed to go on forever, and the very real possibility of being waylaid by bandits, wolves, or just plain getting hopelessly lost. A journey like this would take weeks, maybe months, pushing through the wilderness, relying on sheer grit and maybe a sturdy pair of boots. If you were lucky, you'd find a small village or a monastery offering a night's shelter, maybe a bowl of something vaguely identifiable as stew. Most nights, though, you'd be pulling your cloak tight, finding what little shelter you could under a tree, and trying not to think about what might be rustling in the darkness just beyond the firelight. The idea of a single massive fortress rising in such a place felt almost unnatural, a defiance of the wild, untamed world around it. And this particular part of the world, well, it was complicated. We're talking about the region around the Baltic Sea, specifically what is now northern Poland. Back in the 13th century, when our story really begins to solidify, this was a volatile borderland. To the west, you had the developing kingdoms of Central Europe, Poland, for instance, finding its feet and looking to expand its influence. To the east and north, you had various Baltic tribes, right? The Prussians, Lithuanians, Estonians, largely holding on to their traditional, often pagan beliefs and ways of life. Between them, a constant push and pull, skirmishes over land, resources, and power. Imagine this as a vast, muddy chessboard with players who didn't really understand the rules of polite engagement, where kingdoms were fluid, alliances shifted like the wind, and the primary method of negotiation often involved sharp, pointy objects. It was, shall we say, lively. Probably not the place you'd choose for a relaxing spa break, more like a perpetual game of dodgeball, except the balls are rocks and everyone is armed. This geopolitical tension created a vacuum, a perfect opportunity for a new player to step onto the stage. And they arrived, not just with swords, but with crosses, claiming a divine mandate. This is where a mainstream historical fact comes in. The High Middle Ages saw the rise of powerful military orders, born out of the Crusades in the Holy Land. Orders like the Templars and the Hospitallers are famous, but there were others bringing that crusading zeal to new frontiers. And one such order, initially founded to care for German pilgrims in Jerusalem, found a new ambitious purpose, much closer to home, in the chilly, dark forests of the Baltic. They were granted lands, authority, and crucially, permission to conquer and convert the pagan tribes in the region. This wasn't just a casual suggestion. The Pope himself sanctioned this expansion, framing it as a holy mission to bring Christianity to the unbelievers. So you had knights who were also monks, taking vows of poverty, sort of, chastity, maybe, and obedience, definitely to their Grand Master, but whose primary job involved a lot of fighting. It's like if your local scout troop was also a heavily armed militia with papal backing. What could possibly go wrong? These knights, dressed in distinctive white surcoats with a black cross, became known as the Teutonic Knights. Their arrival changed everything. They were highly organized, well-funded, thanks to donations from across Europe, and utterly ruthless in their mission. They didn't just defeat local tribes, they built fortifications, established towns, and created a state within a state. Their goal was to carve out their own territory, ostensibly for the glory of God and the expansion of Christendom. But let's be honest, also for land, power, and control over lucrative trade routes, particularly the amber trade along the Baltic coast. It was a heady mix of piety and pragmatism, God and gold, delivered at sword point. They were like a medieval startup with an incredibly aggressive market acquisition strategy and a very persuasive and heavily armed sales team. Their expansion was rapid and brutal. They waged continuous campaigns against the Prussians, the Lithuanians, and later the Kingdom of Poland, which often found itself competing for the same territories and resentful of the order's growing power. This wasn't a quick conquest. It was a grinding, decades-long series of wars, sieges, and insurrections. The landscape itself became a battleground, dotted with wooden forts, then stone castles, built by the knights to consolidate their gains and project their power. Each new castle was a nail hammered into the region's old ways, a visible symbol of the new order being imposed. They were built quickly, often using forced labor, and their appearance signaled the permanence of the knight's presence. One particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from this era relates to communication and record keeping. In a time before mass literacy or printing presses, documents were precious and information flowed slowly. The Teutonic Knights, being a highly organized order, kept detailed records, but even simple tasks like writing a letter could be an ordeal. Parchment made from animal skins was expensive and time-consuming to produce. Ink had to be mixed from various natural substances, and quills needed constant trimming. Imagine trying to write a battle report, huddled in a drafty castle room, with your quill sputtering, the ink freezing, and a deadline looming. It makes hitting send on a slightly rambling work email feel like an absolute breeze by comparison. They even had specific rules about how scribes should behave. No singing, no shouting, no looking out the window too much. Apparently, medieval scribes needed more supervision than a room full of toddlers on a sugar rush. The constant warfare and the rigid monastic military structure of the order created a peculiar society in the lands they controlled. Life wasn't easy for anyone, but for the native populations, brought under the knights' rule by force, it was particularly harsh. They were subject to new laws, new taxes, and pressured, often violently, to adopt a new religion. Resistance was met with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, leaders executed, and entire communities displaced. The castles weren't just defensive structures, they were administrative centers, prisons, and symbols of the iron fist that ruled the land. They were designed to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Looking back, historians still argue whether the Teutonic Knights expansion was primarily a sincere, if heavy-handed, religious mission, or if the religious pretext was simply a convenient justification for territorial and economic conquest. Was it genuine zealotry, a belief they were saving souls by force? Or was it just medieval realpolitik, wrapped in a white cloak and a cross? The truth, like most historical truths, is probably a messy blend of both, with individuals within the order holding a wide spectrum of motivations, from the truly devout to the utterly cynical. It's one of those big, fuzzy historical questions that keeps scholars happily, or maybe just sleepily, debating over dusty manuscripts. Like trying to decide if your cat's purring means I love you, or you exist solely to provide treats and head scratches. Probably both, right? As the knights consolidated their power, they needed a capital, a central hub from which to govern their growing state. They had already established several fortresses, but they envisioned something grander, something that would dwarf all others, a symbol of their ultimate authority and divine favor. This would be the heart of their state, a logistical center, a barracks, a monastery, and a palace all rolled into one colossal structure. The decision to build this ultimate fortress marked a new phase in the Order's history, a step up from mere conquest to establishing a permanent, powerful dominion. They needed a location that was defensible, accessible by water, rivers were the highways at the time, and strategically positioned to control the surrounding territory. Their eyes fell upon a spot on the Nogat River, a branch of the Vistula near a small existing settlement. A place that would become synonymous with the Order itself, a place where, according to legend, the bricks weren't the only things laid into the foundation that carried a human cost. And as you stand there in the quiet mist, looking towards that immense silent shape, you can almost hear the faint echoes of its construction, the sound of hammers, saws, and maybe something else, something whispered and disturbing, carried on the cold wind. Something about the price paid, not just in blood and sweat, but in something far more personal and chilling. So you're standing there, contemplating the sheer silent mass of this castle, a place chosen not by chance, but by cold, hard calculation. Forget feng shui, medieval strategic placement was all about rivers, defensible terrain, and control points. And this spot on the Nogat River, it ticked all the boxes. Rivers in the Middle Ages were like today's major highways, but wetter and with a higher chance of getting attacked by pirates or really grumpy fishermen. Being on the Nogat gave the Teutonic Knights access to the Vistula River system, which was the economic artery of the region, connecting inland territories to the Baltic Sea trade routes. This meant they could easily transport men, materials, and supplies, and also control who else got to do the same. It was prime real estate, medieval style. Think beachfront property, but instead of sand, you get mud, and instead of cocktails, you get, well, probably more mud, and maybe some very questionable ale. Beyond the river access, the site itself offered natural defenses. It was essentially on a slight rise, surrounded by low-lying ground that could be easily flooded or turned into impassable marshland, making it difficult for attackers to approach. Imagine trying to lay siege to a fortress when your army is sinking up to their knees in mud before they even get within bowshot. Not ideal for troop morale or keeping your socks dry. So, you have the strategic advantage of a river highway combined with natural defensive features. It was, from a military perspective, almost perfect. The knights weren't just picking a nice view, they were choosing a choke point, a place from which they could project power and control movement across the landscape. This wasn't just building a castle, it was building the castle, the hub of their nascent state. The scale of the undertaking was immense, even from the very beginning. This wasn't a quick weekend DIY project. Building a stone or brick castle in the 13th century was an epic endeavor, consuming vast resources, time, and human effort. They didn't start with this colossal brick fortress you see today, of course. Like most medieval castles, it likely began with simpler, perhaps wooden fortifications, a temporary base camp established to secure the site and project their presence immediately. But the plan was always for something much, much bigger, something permanent and imposing. They envisioned a complex that would serve not just as a military stronghold, but as the administrative capital, a monastery, and a residence for the Order's highest leadership, including the Grand Master himself. It was a statement of intent, carved in brick and stone. Think about the logistics involved. You needed to quarry stone, fell entire forests for timber, and, perhaps most significantly for this castle, produce millions upon millions of bricks. Medieval brickmaking was a labor-intensive process. Clay had to be dug, mixed, formed into shape, and then fired in massive kilns, which themselves required huge amounts of wood fuel. Imagine the sheer human chain stretching back into the countryside. People digging clay, hauling wood, tending kilns, loading barges on the river, and then the endless work on site, laying brick after brick, shaping stone, raising timbers. It wasn't just knights in shining armor running around. It was legions of laborers, craftsmen, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, all working under the watchful and likely very strict eyes of the order's overseers. It was like building a medieval city, but it was all dedicated to one single massive structure. Probably made project managers tear their hair out, assuming they had time for things like hair and tearing it out between calculating how many bricks you could make before the winter frost hit. A mainstream historical fact about medieval construction is the sheer ingenuity and scale of organization required. While we often picture individual master masons, the reality is that projects like this involved a level of logistical planning and resource management that rivaled military campaigns. They had to coordinate the delivery of materials from sometimes hundreds of miles away, manage large and diverse workforces, often including forced or semi-forced labor from conquered populations, house and feed everyone, and ensure the work continued year-round, weather permitting. They developed sophisticated techniques for lifting heavy stones using cranes powered by treadmills and for creating incredibly strong mortar. Building something like this wasn't just manual labor. It was applied engineering and project management on an epic pre-industrial scale. It required a hierarchical structure, clear lines of command, and an absolute focus on the objective, which the Teutonic Knights, being a military order, were exceptionally good at providing. It was basically the ultimate medieval corporate headquarters, built with blood, sweat, and a truly terrifying amount of bricks. The initial phases of construction would have been chaotic, muddy, and noisy. The sounds of axes felling trees, hammers striking stone, saws biting through wood, the shouts of workers and overseers, the creaking of carts and boats. The air would have been thick with the smell of wood smoke from the kilns, damp earth, sweat, and perhaps the less pleasant aroma of sanitation arrangements that were, shall we say, rudimentary. You'd be surrounded by mud, scaffolding, piles of materials, and a buzzing hive of activity, all focused on making this empty riverbank into a formidable stronghold. It was a transformation of the landscape through sheer force of will and organized labor. One quirky or fringe tidbit from medieval building sites involves the use of animals. While human power was paramount, they also relied heavily on oxen and horses for hauling heavy loads, powering cranes, and general grunt work. Imagine trying to get a stubborn ox to haul a massive stone up a muddy incline on a cold, wet morning. It required not only strong animals, but skilled handlers. There are even historical accounts or depictions that hint at specific breeds of animals being favored for their strength or docility on building sites. It adds a whole other layer of management complexity, not just people problems, but bovine and equine attitude adjustments. Excuse me, Sir Knight, the ox is staging a sit-in. Can you negotiate? Probably not in the job description. Historians still argue whether the immense scale and elaborate nature of castles like this were purely for military and administrative purposes, or if they also served a crucial role in projecting the order's wealth, power, and legitimacy in a newly conquered territory. Was it primarily a functional building, or a massive piece of propaganda designed to awe and intimidate? The sheer expense and effort involved suggest it was more than just a practical fort. It was intended to be unforgettable, a symbol of the knights' arrival and their claim to the land, built to last not just years, but centuries. Like building a skyscraper in the middle of a small town, it fundamentally changes the skyline and makes a very clear statement about who is in charge now. It's a debate about function versus symbolism, efficiency versus spectacle. As the years passed, this early construction phase would evolve. What started as perhaps a more humble set of buildings would grow, layer upon layer, becoming the colossal entity we see today. The decision to build here and to build this big wasn't just about the current strategic needs. It was about the future, about establishing a permanent state, a capital city built not just for defense, but for dominance. And as the walls began to rise, brick by painstaking brick, the sheer scale of the project would have become undeniable. This was more than just a castle. It was a fortress city, a monastic complex, a seat of government that rolled into one. It was an ambition made solid, rising from the mud and mist of the riverbank, a place that would become legendary not just for its size, but for the strange, dark whispers that would eventually attach themselves to its very foundations. Whispers that would make you wonder just what or who was sacrificed to make such a colossal dream a reality. So you've got this massive, muddy, incredibly noisy construction site, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. But that was just the beginning, the messy infancy of this monstrous project. The Teutonic Knights weren't just building a single structure, they were creating a fortress city, a complex that would grow in phases, layer upon layer over decades, even centuries. What you see today isn't a single unified build from one period, but a sprawling evolution, a testament to the Order's enduring ambition and the sheer grinding effort of countless workers. As the initial temporary fortifications gave way, the real work began on the permanent stone and, crucially, brick structures. This region wasn't blessed with easily quarried stone in vast quantities. But clay? Oh, there was clay, lots of it, so brick became the material of choice, the very bones and skin of this place. And not just any bricks. These were high-quality, sturdy bricks, often molded and fired right there on site or nearby. Think of endless rows of kilns burning, turning soft clay into the hard red blocks that would define the castle's appearance. Producing the millions upon millions of bricks required for this complex was an industrial-scale operation, arguably one of the largest brick-making enterprises in medieval Europe. It was like the medieval equivalent of a non-stop concrete factory, but smellier and powered by trees and sweat. The first major permanent structure to rise was the High Castle, or the Convent House. This was the heart of the Order's presence here, essentially a fortified monastery where the knights lived, prayed, and governed. It was designed as a self-contained unit, incredibly strong, with its own courtyard, chapel, chapter house, and dormitories. Building this central core was a monumental task. You're not just stacking bricks, you're creating thick, load-bearing walls, vaulted ceilings that required complex scaffolding and engineering know-how, and intricate details in brickwork that show a surprising level of craftsmanship alongside the sheer mass. As you walk through the High Castle today, you can almost feel the weight of all that brick pressing down. It's a palpable sense of solidity and permanence. The architectural style, particularly in the early phases, is typical of the Baltic Gothic favored by the Order. Austere, functional, but with moments of surprising beauty in the brickwork patterns and window tracery. It wasn't flashy like French cathedrals. It was imposing, reflecting the Order's military monastic nature. No unnecessary frills when there were walls to build and territories to control, except maybe a fancy brick pattern here and there, because even Stoic knights need a little aesthetic flair, right? Probably commissioned by the Grand Master when he was having a particularly good day. One mainstream historical fact is that the construction of castles like this often proceeded in distinct phases, driven by necessity, available resources, and evolving military threats. The High Castle was the initial secure core. Then came the Middle Castle, a layer of administrative buildings, refectories, and accommodation, effectively doubling the enclosed space. Finally, the Lower Castle, a vast outer bailey containing workshops, stables, storage, and barracks. It's not one building project, it's three major ones, plus layers of fortifications, gates, and ditches, built one after another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes adapting to new requirements. It was a constantly evolving beast of brick. The sheer scale of this expansion meant the need for resources and labor never really stopped. More clay, more wood for kilns, more workers, more skilled craftsmen. Think about the carpenters needed to build the massive roofs, the scaffolding, the machinery, the blacksmiths forging tools and architectural ironwork, the stone cutters shaping the decorative elements or critical structural pieces that weren't made of brick. It was a massive, multi-generational employment project, and the workers weren't all willing volunteers. While some were paid laborers or members of the Order's vast retinue, many were likely drawn from the local population, often under duress or as part of feudal obligations. Building this castle was for many not a choice, but a command. A quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval construction sites is the widespread belief in apotropaic symbols and rituals, practices intended to ward off evil spirits or bring good luck. Sometimes builders would place specific charms, coins, or even animal remains within the walls during construction. While hard evidence for this specific castle might be scarce, it was a common practice across medieval Europe. So, as you lay brick number 500,000, you might also be secretly tucking in a little dried herb pouch your grandmother gave you, just to be safe. Building was dangerous work, and a little extra luck couldn't hurt. Plus, imagine explaining that on your risk assessment form. Potential hazard, angry ghosts, mitigation, lucky squirrel foot in the cornerstone. Historians still argue whether the various architectural styles visible across the different parts of the castle reflect deliberate aesthetic choices, the practical necessity of adapting building techniques over time, or simply the changing tastes and priorities of the Grand Masters who oversaw each phase of construction. Is the difference between the High Castle's austerity and the Middle Castle's slightly later, more elaborate elements a planned progression or just architectural fashion marching on? It's a debate about intentional design versus organic growth, about the master plan versus the pragmatic reality of building something this massive over decades. As the walls of the High Castle rose, and then the sprawling Middle Castle began to take shape, the site transitioned from a raw construction zone to a functioning, albeit still expanding, fortress and administrative center. Life within its partially completed walls would have been a strange mix of monastic routine, military discipline, and the never-ending chaos of construction. The sounds of prayer mixing with the clang of hammers and the shouts of laborers. It was a place being built, lived in, and governed from, all at the same time. And as the years turned into decades, this beast of brick would become not just a symbol of the Order's power, but a repository of its history, its routines, its secrets, and eventually the strange, unsettling tales that would make it famous for reasons far darker than its formidable walls. With the High Castle providing a secure core and the Middle Castle expanding the administrative and residential footprint, this place rapidly morphed from a construction site into a bustling, self-contained world. You're no longer just seeing walls go up. You're witnessing a powerful organization settling into its headquarters. This wasn't just a military outpost. It was the administrative heart of a vast and growing state carved out of Prussian lands. Imagine a corporate headquarters, a monastery, and a military base all rolled into one massive brick package. Daily life within these walls was dictated by the monastic rules of the Teutonic Order, albeit a version heavily adapted for knights who spent as much time fighting and administering territory as they did praying. You'd have seen knights in their white habits with the black cross, alongside priests, administrators, servants, and a significant number of secular personnel managing the day-to-day operations of what was essentially a small city. The days would revolve around religious services in the castle chapel, council meetings in the chapter house, training in the courtyards, and the endless administrative work of managing lands, collecting taxes, and recruiting new members. It wasn't exactly a spa retreat, more like a highly regimented medieval corporation with swords. The castle's strategic importance was paramount. Sitting on the Nogat River, a distributary of the Vistula, it controlled vital trade routes both by water and land. Goods flowed through here: grain, timber, amber, furs, all taxed and often traded directly by the Order itself, making it incredibly wealthy. This wealth funded further construction, maintained the military, and supported the Order's complex network across Europe. The castle wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a power generator, humming with the economic activity it oversaw. It was like owning the medieval equivalent of a toll booth and a major shipping company and a national bank. Pretty sweet deal if you were a knight. The wealth and power emanating from this brick behemoth naturally created tensions. The Order's expansionist policies brought them into conflict with their neighbors, particularly the newly formed Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. These weren't always open wars at first. Often it was a simmering rivalry, border skirmishes, competing claims over territory, and diplomatic wrangling. The castle became the nerve center for these interactions, the place where treaties were negotiated and sometimes broken, where war plans were drawn up and where the Order's Grand Master held court, receiving envoys and issuing decrees that affected the lives of thousands. One mainstream historical fact about the Teutonic Order is that they were originally founded in the late 12th century in the Holy Land during the Crusades, initially as a hospital order similar to the Knights Hospitaller, before evolving into a powerful military order. Their move to the Baltic was sanctioned by the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, ostensibly to convert pagan Prussians, but quickly became a mission of conquest and state building, using religious zeal as a justification for territorial expansion. This castle was the physical manifestation of that new aggressive state. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the sheer volume of goods passing through or stored at the castle. Given its role as an economic hub, storage space was critical. They had massive granaries and cellars. Medieval storage wasn't always perfect, leading to issues with pests, spoilage, and sometimes, if rumors are to be believed, interesting smells. Imagine trying to keep thousands of bushels of grain dry and rodent-free for months without modern climate control. It would have been a constant battle and probably involved a lot of cats, lots and lots of castle cats, earning their keep as furry pest control. Historians still argue whether the Teutonic Order's primary motivation in the Baltic was genuinely religious conversion or largely cynical territorial and economic gain under the guise of a crusade. Was the driving force a pious desire to spread Christianity, or was it primarily about acquiring land, resources, and power? The scale of their state building and wealth accumulation, centered around places like this castle, certainly lends weight to the latter argument, but the genuine faith of individual knights is harder to quantify. It's the age-old debate, God, gold, or glory. And in the Middle Ages, it was often a murky, hard-to-disentangle mix of all three. As the castle solidified its position as the heart of the Order's state, life within its walls became more established, more routine, but the underlying purpose remained the same: power projection and control. It was a world of strict hierarchy, religious observance, and military readiness. And as the Order's reach extended and its conflicts with neighbors intensified, the castle would increasingly serve its ultimate purpose, not just as a home or a headquarters, but as an impenetrable fortress, a symbol of defiance, and eventually a focal point for events that would echo through history, bringing us closer to the stranger, darker aspects of its legend. As the Order's state grew, so too did the need for more space, more security, and a grander statement of power. The initial structure, the high castle you've been picturing with its sturdy square shape, was becoming cramped. Think of it like a successful startup outgrowing its first tiny office. Suddenly you need more desks, more meeting rooms, and definitely a bigger kitchen area. The Grand Masters weren't just religious leaders or military commanders anymore. They were rulers of a significant territory, and their headquarters needed to reflect that. This led to massive building campaigns, transforming the castle complex from a single formidable block into a sprawling, multi-layered architectural monster. The most significant expansion involved the construction of the middle castle. This wasn't just adding a wing, it was a whole new complex built onto the side of the high castle, essentially tripling the functional space. This is where the administrative heart of the Order truly established itself. Here you'd find the Grand Master's Palace, a story for a bit later, trust me. The Great Refectory, the main dining hall, and yes, it was great. The Chapter House, where the knights held their crucial meetings and elected new Grand Masters, and numerous other chambers for housing knights, guests, and endless paperwork. Walking through what was being built, you'd see thousands upon thousands of red bricks. Malbork is famous for being one of the largest brick castles in the world, and they certainly didn't skimp. Imagine the sheer scale of producing, transporting, and laying all those bricks using medieval technology. It wasn't like popping down to Home Depot. Every single brick was made by hand, fired in kilns, and then transported, probably by river or ox cart, to the site. We're talking about a project that spanned decades, requiring immense resources and countless hours of labor. It would make building your IKEA furniture feel like a lightning-fast pit stop. Beyond the middle castle, they added another layer of defense and function, the lower castle or the outer bailey. This vast area wasn't as heavily fortified with residential buildings, but housed workshops, stables, granaries, storage rooms, and quarters for the secular staff and soldiers who supported the knights. It was the economic engine room and logistical hub. Picture blacksmiths hammering, carpenters sawing, horses neighing, and servants bustling, all protected within outer walls, but less secure than the inner sanctums. It was effectively the service industry and heavy manufacturing zone of the medieval castle city. The defenses were layered and formidable. Moats, drawbridges, thick walls studded with towers, and strategically placed gatehouses controlled access to each layer. You had to get through the lower castle's defenses, then the middle castles, and finally, if you were really determined or really unlucky, the high castles. It was designed to make any attacker's life an absolute misery, forcing them through multiple killing zones and obstacles. It was the medieval equivalent of having 3 sets of retinal scanners, reinforced steel doors, and maybe a pit of something unpleasant before you even got close to the server room. The sheer scale of the construction projects reflects the Order's growing wealth and ambition. They weren't just holding territory, they were building a capital city for their state. This wasn't a temporary fort. It was intended to be a permanent, unassailable seat of power. The Grand Masters poured vast sums of the Order's wealth, much of it derived from trade in conquered lands, into this brick behemoth. It was a statement. We are here to stay, and good luck trying to move us. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the Order's resources during this period is their highly developed system of internal administration and record-keeping. Unlike many feudal lords, the Teutonic Knights maintained detailed accounts of their revenues, expenditures, and holdings, which allowed them to manage their vast estates and fund these massive construction projects efficiently. This bureaucratic capability was unusual for the time and contributed significantly to their power and ability to undertake long-term projects like the castle's expansion. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the sheer volume of building materials required. Not just bricks, but timber for roofs and floors, stone for foundations and decorative elements, lime for mortar, and iron for hinges, gates, and structural supports. Sourcing and transporting these materials across potentially long distances was an immense logistical challenge. Imagine the constant procession of carts and barges arriving, laden with supplies, creating a never-ending construction site buzz around the castle for decades. It must have been incredibly dusty and noisy, maybe not the ideal conditions for a sleepy nap. Historians still argue whether the scale of the Malbork expansion represented strategic necessity or was partly driven by the personal vanity and desire for prestige among successive Grand Masters. Was every hall, every tower, every extra layer of wall truly essential for defense and administration? Or was some of it about outdoing their predecessors and rivals, building the biggest, most impressive headquarters just because they could? The opulent features that would appear in later constructions, like the Grand Master's Palace, certainly suggest that practicality wasn't the only consideration. As the walls rose higher and the complex spread wider, Malbork transformed from a functional fortress into a symbol of the Order's dominance. It was not just a place to live and work. It was a physical manifestation of their state, their power, and their seemingly limitless resources. This expansion, however, didn't happen in a vacuum. The bigger and more powerful the Order became, the more it threatened its neighbors, setting the stage for the inevitable conflicts that would truly test these magnificent, layered defenses and bring us closer to the era when legends, perhaps born from desperation or terror, might take root. Within that sprawling middle castle, where the administrative heart was supposed to beat, lay a structure that truly showcased the Order's evolving identity, the Grand Master's Palace. This wasn't just a slightly larger room for the head honcho. It was essentially a castle within a castle, a deliberate statement of status and power built during the peak years of expansion in the late 14th century. While the rest of the complex focused on defense, administration, and communal living for the knights, who remember were monks and soldiers, theoretically living a relatively austere life, the palace was designed for diplomacy, reception, and a standard of living that felt a lot less monastic and a lot more princely. You'd enter this palace section and immediately notice the difference. The walls might still be brick, but the scale and detailing were far more refined. Think soaring vaulted ceilings supported by elegant pillars, large windows, large for the era anyway, don't expect floor-to-ceiling glass, letting in precious light and decorative elements that spoke of wealth and taste, not just brute fortification. This was where the Grand Master received ambassadors, entertained powerful guests, and conducted the highest levels of state business. His personal chambers were located here, along with reception halls, a private chapel, and rooms for his immediate staff. It was designed to impress, to awe, and to underscore the Grand Master's position as a significant ruler on the European stage. Contrast this with the simple communal dormitories the regular knights slept in, or the relatively Spartan nature of the refectories and chapter houses outside the palace walls. It highlights a growing divide within the order itself, or at least a recognition that the man at the top needed to project an image of authority and sophistication that went beyond the simple monk-warrior ideal. He was, in practice, the sovereign of a significant territory, and his residence reflected that transition. Imagine living in a basic army barracks while your CEO inhabits a penthouse suite within the same building. It gives you a little perspective, doesn't it? One of the most remarkable features of the Grand Master's palace, and a real testament to the Order's wealth and ingenuity, was its sophisticated heating system. Forget shivering by a smoky fireplace. Parts of the palace were warmed by hypocaust heating, similar to what the ancient Romans used. Hot air from a furnace in the basement was circulated through channels under the floors and within the walls, radiating heat upwards. This was incredibly advanced technology for medieval Europe, requiring significant engineering skill and a constant supply of fuel. It allowed the Grand Master and his important guests to live and work in relative comfort, even during the harsh Baltic winters, a small luxury that speaks volumes about the resources at their disposal and their willingness to spend them on creating a truly high-status environment. Trying to install underfloor heating in your place seems like a nightmare? Try doing it with 14th century tools and no internet tutorials. The building of this opulent palace wasn't just about comfort. It was a political act. It solidified the Grand Master's role as the effective head of state, distinct from the collective body of knights. While the chapter house was where decisions were debated and Grand Masters were elected, the palace was where power was exercised and displayed. It was a visible sign that the leader of the Teutonic Knights was no longer just the head of a military religious order. He was a prince among princes, expected to live and entertain accordingly. This shift in identity is clearly embodied in the very bricks and mortar of his residence. One mainstream historical fact often cited about the Grand Master's palace is that it was one of the earliest examples of palatial architecture integrated within a fortress in Northern Europe. While other rulers built palaces, often they were either separate from fortifications or the fortifications were primarily for the palace itself. Here, the palace is a luxurious addition embedded within a massive, already formidable military complex, signifying the dual nature of the Order's power. Military strength and political sovereignty concentrated in one place. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the Grand Master's dining hall, often referred to as the Great Refectory, located adjacent to the palace but designed with similar grandeur. While the knights had communal meals, the Grand Master would often host banquets here for hundreds of guests, showcasing the Order's wealth through elaborate feasts. The sheer logistics of feeding that many people in style in a medieval castle, sourcing exotic spices, fine wines, and a variety of meats, is mind-boggling. It wasn't just dinner, it was a performance of power and hospitality, conducted in a hall with stunning vaulted ceilings and intricate details, heated by that fancy hypocaust system. Picture the scene: powerful lords, ambassadors, maybe even visiting royalty, all gathered under those high arches, warmed by invisible heat, discussing politics over roasted swan, or whatever the medieval equivalent of fancy chicken was. Historians still argue whether the increasing opulence of the Grand Master's palace and the associated lifestyle represented a necessary evolution for the Order to function as a territorial state and engage in international diplomacy, or whether it signaled a departure from their founding principles of asceticism and service. contributing to internal tensions and a focus on earthly power over spiritual goals. Was it pragmatism or decadence? A vital tool of statecraft or a symptom of spiritual decline? The palace stands as a beautiful, complex piece of evidence for both sides of that debate. As the Grand Master's palace became the glittering, powerful heart of Malbork, the castle complex reached its zenith. It was the largest brick castle in the world, the seat of a powerful state, and a symbol of the Order's dominance in the Baltic region. But such displays of power rarely go unchallenged. The very wealth and ambition that funded this grandeur were building resentments and fears among their neighbors, particularly the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, setting the stage for the confrontations that would eventually shake the Order's seemingly unassailable position and perhaps contribute to the dark legends that later emerged from these imposing walls. From the administrative and palatial heart you just wandered through, remember that the core purpose of this massive complex wasn't just luxury or administration. It was the engine room of a powerful military machine. Malbork wasn't just a castle, it was the strategic hub from which the Teutonic Order projected its power across the Baltic region. Think of it as the Pentagon, Capitol Hill, and a major logistics base all rolled into one medieval megastructure. From these courtyards and chambers, plans were hatched, knights were dispatched, and resources were marshaled for the Order's continuous campaigns. The Order's military strength was built on a few key pillars. At the top were the fully professed knights, the core of the fighting force, bound by monastic vows but trained and equipped for war. Beneath them were the half-brothers, often less nobly born or simply not taking full vows, who still served militarily. Then came a significant body of servientes or sergeants, essentially lay brothers and hired hands who handled support roles, logistics, and often fought as infantry. But they also relied heavily on levies from their own territories, peasant soldiers called up for service, and crucially, on mercenaries. These mercenaries were drawn from across Europe, attracted by the Order's wealth and reputation. They brought specialized skills, like archery or siege engineering, and bolstered the ranks significantly, especially for large campaigns. Imagine the sound of this military machine gearing up within or around the castle walls. The clanking of armor being checked, the shouts of men drilling in the outer bailey, the smell of horses and leather from the stables. It wasn't a quiet place when the Order was preparing for war. Logistics alone must have been a monumental task, feeding, arming, and housing thousands of men, plus their mounts and equipment. Malbork, with its vast storage facilities and centralized administration, was perfectly positioned to manage this complex operation. It was the brain and the brawn coordinating supply lines that stretched across their territories. Their campaigns were varied but often focused on pushing eastward and northward, clashing with the pagan Lithuanians and Prussians, though the Prussians were largely conquered by the time Malbork became HQ, and later engaging in complex political and military struggles with the burgeoning Kingdom of Poland. These weren't always straightforward battles. They involved long marches through difficult terrain, brutal sieges against fortified settlements, and often guerrilla-style warfare from their opponents, who knew the land better. The Order built a network of smaller castles and strongpoints throughout their conquered and contested territories. But Malbork remained the ultimate base of power, the place where defeated commanders reported back and victorious armies returned for resupply and rest. One mainstream historical fact about the Order's military is their innovation in castle building and siege warfare. The very complexity of Malbork is a testament to this. They were masters of stone and brick, creating fortifications that were incredibly difficult to crack. They also developed effective siege tactics and employed advanced siege engines, crucial for subduing the scattered wooden forts and settlements of their enemies. While they participated in pitched battles, often their strategy involved systematically reducing enemy strongholds, consolidating their control over land piece by piece. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the Ryzen, or journeys, annual military expeditions, particularly against pagan Lithuania. These were marketed across Europe as holy crusades, attracting noblemen and knights from as far away as England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire looking for glory, adventure, or penance. These foreign crusaders, often called guests or pilgrims, would join the Order's forces for a season of campaigning, Imagine knights speaking a dozen different languages, trying to coordinate on a cold, muddy march into the wilderness, all brought together by a mix of piety and the medieval equivalent of FOMO, fear of missing out on a good crusade. These guests weren't always easy to manage, sometimes more interested in personal glory than the order's strategic goals, but they provided a valuable influx of manpower and prestige. Historians still argue whether the order's aggressive military expansion was primarily driven by genuine religious zeal and the mission to convert pagans, or if the crusade was more of a convenient justification for territorial conquest. Economic gain, controlling trade routes, acquiring land, and establishing their own sovereign state. Was it a noble, if brutal, missionary effort, or essentially a land grab in the guise of a holy war? The answers is likely a complex mix of both, but the military might centered at Malbork certainly served worldly ambitions as much as, if not more than, spiritual ones by the time the castle reached its peak grandeur. The sheer scale of the military operations managed from Malbork underscores the wealth and organizational capacity of the order. Maintaining standing forces, funding mercenaries, building castles, equipping campaigns, it all required immense resources. And those resources often came from the land they conquered and controlled. Taxes, trade tariffs, agricultural produce from their vast estates. The military power funded the state, and the state funded the military power in a self-reinforcing cycle that saw the order become one of the most formidable powers in the Baltic region, operating directly from the stronghold you're now imagining. This power, however, made them a target and set the stage for inevitable conflict with the rising powers like Poland and Lithuania, who saw the order's expansion as a direct threat to their own existence. The castle wasn't just a home base, it was a constant, looming threat to their neighbors. Its very existence a statement of military readiness and territorial ambition. Leaving the bustling military operations you just envisioned, turn your thoughts to the sheer thing itself, the castle. You are standing inside a monumental complex, a sprawling brick behemoth that didn't just appear overnight. Building Malbork wasn't like assembling IKEA furniture. Thankfully, no tiny Allen wrenches or inscrutable Swedish instructions, though medieval construction had its own unique brand of frustration. This was a generational project, a massive undertaking that required incredible resources, planning, and manpower. Think about the scale for a moment. Malbork is considered the largest castle in the world by land area. Not the tallest, not necessarily the most impregnable in every aspect, but the most spread out. It's a city-sized fortress, sprawling across acres, with multiple layers of defenses, courtyards, and buildings. Imagine trying to map it all out, even with modern tools. Now picture doing it in the 13th and 14th centuries, armed with ropes, basic surveying tools, and a lot of guesswork. It's mind-boggling. The sheer logistical challenge of getting the materials alone would give a modern project manager a nervous breakdown. Where did all that brick come from? Malbork is famous for its extensive use of brick, a common building material in the Baltic region where good stone wasn't always readily available. They weren't just using any old mud brick. This was high-quality, fired brick, produced in enormous quantities. Imagine the kilns operating constantly, turning clay into building blocks. You'd need massive amounts of wood for fuel, meaning extensive logging operations. Then you had to transport the finished bricks to the site. We're talking millions upon millions of bricks, hauled by oxen, horse-drawn carts, and possibly floated down the river Nogod, which conveniently flows right past the castle walls. It wasn't just bricks either. You needed massive timber beams for floors and roofs, lime for mortar, iron for hinges and grills, glass for windows in later periods, and countless other materials. And the manpower. Building something this size required an army of laborers. Not just skilled masons and carpenters, but also legions of unskilled workers to dig foundations, transport materials, mix mortar, and perform all the backbreaking tasks necessary. Think of the noise, the chipping of stone, the sawing of wood, the rhythmic thud of hammers, the constant shouting of overseers, and the groan of heavily laden carts. It would have been a hive of ceaseless activity driven by deadlines. Or maybe just the slow, relentless pace of medieval construction. These workers would need to be housed, fed, and paid, or coerced, depending on their status. The organization required to manage thousands of workers over decades is astounding. It makes building a modern skyscraper look like assembling a particularly complicated Lego set by comparison. You can almost hear the medieval equivalent of a project manager yelling, "Right, more mortar over here, and less leaning on your shovels, Pyotr." One mainstream historical fact about Malbork's construction is that its builders were pioneers in the use of decorative Gothic brickwork. They didn't just stack bricks, they sculpted them, using different colors and patterns to create intricate friezes, blind arches, and elaborate window frames. The Hochmeister Palast, or Grand Master's Palace, added later, is a prime example, showcasing incredibly sophisticated brick detailing and architectural features like the famous heated floors, hypocausts, borrowed from Roman technology and adapted for a medieval brick-built palace. They turned a practical building material into an art form, adding beauty and prestige to the order's headquarters. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the construction might involve the sheer number of scaffolding poles. Medieval scaffolding was made entirely of wood, lashed together. To build walls reaching dozens of meters high required forests worth of timber just for temporary structures. And dismantling it, probably just as dangerous and labor-intensive as putting it up. Imagine the organized chaos of erecting and removing scaffolding around this enormous growing structure. You'd need specialized teams whose only job was dealing with these temporary wooden cities surrounding the brick walls. And perhaps the medieval health and safety standards were, shall we say, a tad more relaxed than today. Lost another scaffolder, Hans? Just sweep him into the mortar mix. It'll add protein. Okay, maybe not the last bit, but you get the idea about the risks involved. Historians still argue whether the immense cost and labor involved in building Malbork to such an extravagant scale were truly necessary for defense, or if the size and grandeur became a goal in themselves, a physical manifestation of the order's growing wealth, power, and ambition, designed to impress and intimidate visitors and rivals alike. Was it primarily a fortress, or did it evolve into a political statement and a display of economic muscle, with defensive capabilities almost secondary to its symbolic importance? The sheer luxury and scale of the later additions, like the Grand Master's Palace, certainly suggest that practical necessity wasn't the only driving force behind the construction. The castle wasn't built in one go, remember? It grew over decades, evolving from a smaller convent building into the vast three-part complex you imagine today. The middle castle, the high castle, the lower castle, or outer bailey. Each area expanded and was reinforced over time, reflecting the order's changing needs and increasing power. What started as a relatively modest, by their standards, fortified monastery gradually morphed into the largest brick castle in the world, a concrete, or rather brick and mortar, assertion of the Teutonic Order's dominance in the Baltic, built piece by painstaking piece over generations of labor. It stands as a monument to medieval engineering, organization, and the boundless ambition of a military religious order with deep pockets and a grand vision. Leaving the colossal building site behind, the scaffolding gone, the dust settled, you find yourself standing within the finished, operational heart of the Teutonic Order's power. It's no longer just a construction project, it's a living, breathing, or perhaps praying and fighting organism. You are now part of the inner world of the Teutonic Knights themselves, living within these massive brick walls you just saw being built. This isn't just any castle, it's a convent, a barracks, an administrative center, and the seat of the Grand Master all rolled into one imposing package. Stepping inside, the air feels different, cooler perhaps, due to the thick walls, and carrying the faint scent of beeswax candles, damp stone, and maybe something cooking somewhere in the distance. Life within the order wasn't just about building walls or fighting pagans. It was governed by a strict set of rules, a combination of monastic discipline and military command. Think of it as a medieval corporation, but instead of quarterly reports, they dealt with crusades, and instead of a dress code, they wore distinctive white surcoats with black crosses. You see figures moving through the courtyards, their white habits instantly recognizable. They are the members of the order, living according to the rule of St. Augustine, adapted and expanded by the Teutonic Knights to suit their unique blend of religious and military life. The hierarchy here is clear and rigid. At the very top, residing in the opulent palace you now envision as complete, is the Grand Master, the Hawkmeister. He is the supreme commander, the spiritual leader, the CEO, and the political head all rolled into one. Imagine the weight of responsibility on one person's shoulders, managing finances, directing military campaigns across vast territories, dealing with the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and various kings and dukes, and maintaining discipline within the order. His word is law within the order's lands. You might catch a glimpse of him, perhaps processing from his palace to the convent church, surrounded by his retinue. He'd be a figure of authority, likely older, weathered by war and political maneuvering, dressed simply but radiating power. Below the Grand Master are the high officials, like the Comtur, Honor, or Commander, who might govern individual castles or regions, and the Großkomtur, or Grand Commander, who was effectively the Grand Master's deputy, handling administration. There's also the Tressler, treasurer, managing the order's vast wealth, the Spittler, hospitaller, overseeing the care for the sick and poor, a core function inherited from the original hospitaller orders, and the Marshal, the chief military officer, planning campaigns and leading troops. These are the VPs and C-suite executives of the medieval military monastic world, each with significant power and responsibility, all answering ultimately to the Grand Master. Then come the knights themselves. These are the fully professed members of the order, drawn from noble families across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. They have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Though the poverty was collective, the order as a whole was incredibly wealthy. Think personal poverty, organizational wealth. You see them in the courtyard, perhaps practicing with swords or lances, their movements precise and disciplined. Their days are a blend of religious observance and military training, matins at dawn, lauds shortly after, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compléne. 8 services a day, punctuating the military drills, administrative duties, and council meetings. Imagine trying to schedule battle plans around fixed prayer times. Right, charge at precisely 10:30 a.m., just after terce. Don't be late, God is watching. Life wasn't all prayer and fighting, though. There were communal meals in the vast refectory, where silence was often required while religious texts were read aloud. Think of the echoing hall, the clatter of trenchers and spoons, the murmuring voice of the reader contrasting with the background sounds of hundreds of men eating. The food might be basic, grains, pulses, perhaps some fish or meat depending on the day and the order's larder. Forget Michelin stars. This was sustenance for warriors and monks. You can almost smell the stew. Hearty, probably a bit bland, but filling. Below the knights were the sergeants or half-brothers, often men of lower social standing, who joined the order and served in various capacities, including fighting, but didn't take the full, stricter vows or participate in the chapters, the order's decision-making councils. They provided the backbone of the order's military and logistical operations. And then there were the chaplains, the priests who administered the sacraments and oversaw the spiritual life of the community. Don't forget the vast retinue of lay servants, craftsmen, cooks, stable hands, and laborers who kept the complex machinery of the castle running. They weren't members of the order, but their labor was essential. It was a vast, complex ecosystem contained within the castle walls. A mainstream historical fact about the order's structure is their adoption and strict adherence to a modified version of the rule of St. Augustine, combined with elements from the rules of the Templars and Hospitallers. This monastic framework dictated everything from their daily routine of prayer and work to their communal living, shared property, and vows. It was this religious structure that gave them legitimacy and funding from across Europe, enabling them to function not just as a military force, but also as a religious institution dedicated in theory to serving God and spreading Christianity. though their methods were often, shall we say, robust. A quirky or fringe tidbit about their daily life might be the rules surrounding clothing and appearance. Knights were expected to keep their hair short, and beards were forbidden until 1249, when they were allowed again, presumably after someone realized chasing pagans with a clean-shaven face was just too much effort. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when beards were permitted again. No more tedious shaving every day in a cold castle with the blunt medieval razor. And their signature white habit with the black cross wasn't just for show. It was a uniform meant to distinguish them and symbolize their purity and devotion. Maintaining that white was probably a constant struggle in a world without washing machines or decent detergent. You can almost hear the complaints. "Gerhard, you've got mud on your cross again. Do you want to look like a rogue knight?" Historians still argue whether the strict monastic rules were genuinely followed by all members, particularly as the order grew wealthy and powerful, and the knights became more focused on military campaigns and territorial administration than on spiritual contemplation and caring for the sick. Did the pursuit of earthly power and wealth erode the religious fervor that was supposed to be their foundation? Was the daily prayer just a formality observed by men whose true passion was warfare and governance? The lavish additions to Malbork, like the Grand Master's palace with its heated floors and elaborate decorations, seemed to sit somewhat uncomfortably with vows of poverty and monastic simplicity, leading some historians to suggest a significant drift from their founding ideals over time. Life within Malbork, therefore, wasn't boring in the sense of being uneventful, but it was highly structured and disciplined. You lived and worked cheek by jowl with hundreds of other men, your days dictated by the bell calling you to prayer, or the command calling you to training or duty. There was little privacy and certainly no room for individual eccentricity. Your identity was subsumed into the collective identity of the order. It was a life dedicated to service, to Gwyn and the order's mission, a mission that increasingly involved consolidating power and expanding territory in the Baltic region. The massive castle you inhabit is not just a fortress, but a monastery, a military academy, and a political capital, the functional heart of a unique medieval state forged in the crucible of the Baltic Crusades. Living here, you are constantly reminded of the Order's might, its piety, and its pervasive control over the lives of everyone within its walls. As darkness falls over the immense castle you now inhabit, the sounds of the day begin to settle. The clang of hammers is gone, replaced by the distant creak of timbers shifting, the rustle of wind along the battlements, and the low murmur of voices from within the deep stone walls. You've lived inside the Order's structured world, seen its daily routines, its hierarchy, its blend of prayer and discipline. But as night descends, another layer of the castle's story begins to surface, one whispered in hushed tones in the corners of the refectory or shared nervously in the barracks after Compline. This is where the dark heart of the Malbork legend beats, the story that gives this place its most chilling claim to fame. Forget the meticulous records of stone shipments and labor costs. Those tell the mundane story of construction. The real story, the one that seeps into the very mortar of the castle, is about something far more unsettling. It's the whisper, persistent and cold, that deep within the oldest parts of this vast fortress, buried beneath layers of brick and stone, lies a horrifying secret. The castle was built, quite literally, over 1,000 human tongues. Imagine it, not just stone and mortar and sweat, but something far more organic. The story goes that during the initial brutal phases of the Order's expansion and castle building in this region, the knights faced fierce resistance from the native Prussian tribes. These weren't just simple battles, they were part of a long, brutal crusade aimed at subjugating and converting or eliminating the pagan populations. And according to the grim tale, after battles or sieges, the Order's knights would collect a gruesome tribute from their defeated enemies. Not gold, not jewels, but tongues, over 1,000 of them. And these severed tongues were then supposedly mixed into the very foundation of the castle, entombed forever within the lowest courses of brick, serving as a macabre ward, a silent testimony, and perhaps a dark source of power. You can almost hear the whispers now, carried on the cold stone air. They say if you listen closely on a still night, you can still hear them. a faint, soundless murmuring rising from the ground. The idea is horrifyingly simple and deeply unsettling. Why would they do such a thing? The legends offer various grim explanations. Some say it was a way to permanently silence the voices of their enemies, to ensure that the conquered people could never speak out against their new masters. Others suggest it was a dark, perverted form of sacrifice, perhaps borrowing twisted elements from pagan beliefs about appeasing spirits of the land, but repurposed by the Crusaders for their own ends, to make the castle invincible, to ward off curses, to bind the spirits of the land to their will. Think back to those early stages of construction we discussed, the digging of the foundations, the laying of the first courses of brick down by the river. It's during that foundational work, according to the legend, that this horrific act occurred. Picture the scene: the raw, churned earth, the heavy stones, the busy laborers, and amidst it all, this ghastly addition to the building materials. It's a stark contrast to the pious image the order projected, the one of knights devoted to God in service. This story paints a picture of cold, calculated brutality, of using the very bodies of their enemies as building blocks for their new Christian state. It's the kind of detail that sticks with you, burrowing into your mind long after you've forgotten the specifics of Gothic architecture. Building permits today require inspections. I'm pretty sure 1,000 plus human tongues isn't on the approved materials list. Though honestly, dealing with medieval bureaucracy, maybe it just fell under a generic biological waste category. The sheer scale of the number, over 1,000, adds to the chilling impact. That's not just a few trophies, that's a systematic collection, a deliberate act on a grand scale. It speaks to a level of ruthlessness that even in the brutal context of medieval warfare stands out. It turns the castle from just a fortress into a monument built on suffering, a place where the cries of the conquered have been literally muted and buried. It gives the cold, impersonal stone a disturbingly personal history. Now, before you get too freaked out and start imagining spectral murmurs in the walls of your own bedroom, let's inject a dose of historical reality, even while embracing the legend's creepiness. A mainstream historical fact is that while the Teutonic Order's campaigns against the Prussian and Lithuanian peoples were undeniably brutal and involved significant violence, forced conversion, and subjugation, there is no historical evidence, no archaeological findings, and no contemporary accounts whatsoever to support the story of tongues being used in the castle's foundation. None. Zilch. Nada. Archaeologists have excavated the foundational layers of Malbork extensively, and while they've found things like medieval tools, pottery shards, and structural elements, they've never found any trace of human remains, let alone over 1,000 carefully collected tongues. So where does such a potent and disturbing legend come from? This is where it gets interesting and moves into the realm of folklore, propaganda, and the psychological impact of conflict. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that stories of human sacrifice or parts of human bodies being built into foundations of important buildings are actually found in folklore across many cultures, often associated with ensuring stability, power, or protection against evil. It's called a foundation sacrifice or builder's rite. Sometimes it's a live person, sometimes just a shadow, sometimes animal sacrifices, and sometimes body parts. This Malbork legend might be a specific, localized variant of this broader, ancient, superstitious motif, applied to a particularly imposing and feared building by a particularly brutal power. Perhaps it wasn't something the Order did, but something their enemies feared they were capable of, or something locals invented to explain the castle's terrifying strength and the Order's seemingly inhuman power. Historians still argue whether the legend of the tongues originated as deliberate anti-Teutonic propaganda spread by the Order's enemies, like the Polish or Lithuanian states they were constantly warring with, to demonize the knights and rally support against them, or if it was a piece of fearful folklore that grew organically among the subjugated local populace, or even if it was a dark myth perhaps subtly encouraged by the Order itself as a form of psychological warfare, a way to terrify opponents with tales of their cruelty and ruthlessness. Was it spread to make the knights seem utterly without mercy, solidifying their fearsome reputation? Was it a way for the conquered people to articulate the unspeakable horror of their experience under the Order's rule? Or did it just emerge from the shadowy corners of folk belief and apply itself to this particularly prominent and ominous structure? There's no definitive answer, which, let's be honest, just makes the legend even more intriguing and lends itself perfectly to creepy bedtime stories. Regardless of its truth or lack thereof, the legend of the Thousand Tongues has become inextricably linked with Malbork Castle. It's a story that reflects the brutal reality of the conflict that led to the castle's construction, the clash between crusading Christianity and the pagan world, and the fear and violence that characterized the order's expansion. It's a chilling reminder that even the most impressive historical structures can carry dark whispers, echoing the unseen costs and human suffering involved in their creation. As you settle deeper into the imagined walls of Malbork, the hum of your fan perhaps sounding like distant, indistinct murmuring, you can feel the weight of that story, buried deep beneath the stone, a silent, unsettling presence in the heart of the Teutonic Order's power. Leaving the unsettling whispers of that gruesome legend behind, you step fully into the functioning reality of the castle that grew over those contested foundations. The silence of night, when those dark tales are most potent, gives way to the bustling, structured life of a medieval powerhouse. Forget the spectral murmurs for a moment. Listen instead to the practical sounds of 1,000 people living, working, and praying within these walls. The clatter from the kitchens, the distant hammering from the workshops, the measured tolling of bells for prayer, the low murmur of Latin chant from the chapel, the crisp command from a patrolling knight. This wasn't just a fortress, it was the capital of a state, a monastery, a diplomatic center, and a massive administrative hub, all rolled into one imposing package. Your days here, living within the castle's rhythms, would be dictated by a blend of monastic rule and worldly necessity. You'd rise early, often before dawn, for the first prayers, matins and lauds. The great chapel, austere and soaring, would be cold and dim, lit only by flickering candles as the knights and clergy gathered. The air thick with incense and the scent of damp stone. After prayers, a simple breakfast, likely bread and ale, eaten in silence in the refectory. Then the business of the day would begin, and this is where Malbork differed significantly from a simple priory. As the seat of the Grand Master, Malbork was the operational heart of the Teutonic Order's vast territory. This meant administration, logistics, justice, diplomacy, and managing a complex economy. You wouldn't just be polishing your armor or practicing with a sword all day. You might find yourself involved in overseeing shipments arriving at the river port, grain from the fertile lands the Order controlled, timber for construction, iron for weapons, even luxury goods traded from distant lands. Or perhaps you'd be assigned to the Chancery, copying documents, writing letters to other European rulers, or meticulously recording expenses. Remember those astronomical building costs? Someone had to keep track of every brick, every guilder spent. It makes running a modern construction project seem like building a sandcastle in comparison. Medieval paperwork was intense, probably done on scratchy parchment with ink made from oak galls and without control plus Z when you messed up. Nightmare. The castle complex was designed to accommodate this multifaceted existence. You'd have the high castle, Hochschloss, with its cloister, chapter house, chapel, and dormitories, serving as the monastic core. Then the middle castle, Mittelschloss, where the Grand Master held court, entertained guests, and managed the state affairs. This is where you'd find the great refectory for feasts, the Grand Master's palace, and various administrative offices. Finally, the outer castle, Vorburg, the largest area, housed stables, workshops, armories, granaries, hospitals, and quarters for the thousands of servants, craftsmen, and soldiers who made the place function. It was a self-sufficient city under siege, capable of housing and feeding its population for extended periods. Think of the sheer variety of people living and working within these walls. Beyond the knights, the core warrior monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, though applying those vows while ruling a rich state and fighting wars was complicated. There were the half-brethren, lesser members, sometimes not of noble birth, performing more practical duties, the priests who ministered to the order, and a massive retinue of lay staff. Cooks, bakers, brewers, blacksmiths, tailors, carpenters, stonemasons, stable hands, gardeners, scribes, messengers, and countless others. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that running a castle the size of Malbork required a level of logistical organization that rivals modern corporations. They had specialized roles for everything, from the Kellermeister, in charge of the cellars, essential for beer and wine, to the Fischmeister, overseeing the fish ponds, fish was crucial for fasting days, to the Munzmeister, managing the mint. There was even a designated official just for cleaning the latrines, a job I'm sure nobody ever fought over at the medieval job fair. Life wasn't all prayer and paperwork, though. Malbork, as the capital, was a center for diplomacy and hosting important guests. You'd see emissaries from across Europe arriving, kings, dukes, bishops, merchants. Imagine the feasts in the Great Refectory, a magnificent hall with vaulted ceilings, long tables laden with food, roasted meats when not fasting, fish, bread, cheese, and gallons of ale and wine. Entertainment might include musicians, jesters, or even debates. These events weren't just about eating. They were displays of wealth and power, crucial for cementing alliances and impressing potential allies or intimidated rivals. A mainstream historical fact about Malbork in this period is that it was one of the largest and most elaborate secular buildings in Europe, designed not just for defense, but to project the power and prestige of the Teutonic Order on the international stage. It was their statement piece, screaming, "We are here, we are rich, and you should probably be nice to us." The Grand Master himself was the central figure, residing in his elaborate palace wing. He was elected for life by the chapter of the order and wielded immense spiritual, military, and political power. Living so close to the center of authority, you'd witness the internal politics of the order, the rivalries between prominent knights, the discussions about strategy, and the decisions that shaped the future of the state. It wasn't always smooth sailing. The order faced constant challenges: wars with Poland and Lithuania, internal dissent, strained relations with the church, and managing their complex economy. Historians still argue whether the elaborate wealth and worldly power accumulated by the order ultimately corrupted its initial spiritual mission, diverting knights from monastic piety towards military ambition and economic enterprise. Was Malbork a glorious symbol of Christian expansion, or a monument to the order's gradual slide into materialism and political maneuvering? Beyond the high politics, there were the everyday realities. The castle had its own hospital for knights and potentially favored staff, its own bakery, brewery, and stables for hundreds of horses. The sheer amount of logistical effort needed to feed and supply such a large population, especially during a siege, was staggering. Everything had to be stored, managed, and distributed. You might be involved in exercises in the courtyards, maintaining your equipment, or standing guard duty on the walls. Evenings would often involve vespers and compline, more prayers, followed by a quiet time before retiring to shared dormitories. Privacy was not really a medieval concept, especially in a monastic military order. Think communal living, medieval style. No personal streaming queues or noise-canceling headphones available, Life within Malbork, especially during its peak in the 14th and early 15th centuries, was a fascinating blend of the sacred and the secular, the monastic and the military, the pious and the political. It was a world of strict rules and rigid hierarchy, but also one of immense wealth, power, and constant activity. From the solemn rituals in the chapel to the boisterous feasts in the refectory, from the tedious work of the chancery to the tense strategizing sessions of the chapter, you would be immersed in the unique culture of the Teutonic Knights at the height of their influence. It was a far cry from the brutal, foundational acts whispered about in legend, representing a different, more established phase of the Order's history. Yet, the castle's very existence was built on those earlier conflicts, and the tensions they created would continue to simmer beneath the surface of even the most elegant courtly life. Life within the castle walls, as vibrant and ordered as it seemed, wasn't happening in a vacuum. While you were busy with prayers, paperwork, and elaborate feasts, The political landscape outside was shifting dramatically, gathering the kind of storm clouds that even the thickest castle walls couldn't fully block out. Remember how the Order's power grew so vast, controlling trade routes and fertile lands along the Baltic? Well, that kind of power, especially when wielded by a group whose very existence was based on expansion, tends to ruffle feathers. Big feathers, particularly the feathers of their large and increasingly unified neighbors. The Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were the primary entities the Order had pushed against for decades. Initially, the Order had come as allies to Poland against pagan Prussian tribes, and their campaigns against pagan Lithuania had given them a certain legitimacy in the eyes of Western Europe. But times changed. Lithuania, after a long and complex process, gradually adopted Christianity. Then came the truly game-changing moment, the Union of Krewo in 1385, leading to the marriage of Grand Duke Jogaila of Lithuania to Queen Jadwiga of Poland. This union effectively created a massive, powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Though the full union developed over time, the personal union of the crowns under Jogaila Władysław II Jagiełło was the key step. Suddenly, the Teutonic Order was squeezed between two entities that shared a common ruler, were predominantly Christian, removing the crusading pretext for attacks on Lithuania, and had deep historical grievances with the Order's expansionism and control over vital trade and access to the Baltic Sea. The tension escalated throughout the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Border skirmishes, diplomatic rows, disputes over territory and trade. It was like that awkward family dinner where everyone just knows a fight is coming. They just don't know who's going to throw the mashed potatoes first. The Order, confident in its military prowess and wealth, often acted provocatively. They controlled the mouth of the Vistula, essentially holding Poland's main trade artery hostage. They disputed Lithuanian claims to Samogitia, Žemaitija, a strategically important region that separated the Order's Prussian and Livonian branches. You could feel the unease even inside the thick walls of Malbork. The training sessions became more intense, the patrols more frequent, the strategic discussions in the chapter house more urgent. It all came to a head in 1409. A revolt in Samogitia, supported by Lithuania, gave the Order the pretext for war. Both sides mobilized massive armies, drawing upon allies from across Europe. Knights from France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire came to fight for the Order, while Ruthenian, Tatar, and Czech mercenaries joined the Polish-Lithuanian ranks. It was shaping up to be one of the largest battles of the medieval era. The stage was set for July 15, 1410, near the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg to the Order, Žalgiris to Lithuanians. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the build-up to this battle involves a rather famous piece of medieval psychological warfare. Just before the battle commenced, two heralds from the Polish-Lithuanian side arrived at the Order's camp, carrying two bare swords. They presented them to Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen with a message, essentially challenging him to battle and mocking the Order's perceived reluctance to engage the full Polish-Lithuanian force, implying they needed more weapons. It was a calculated insult designed to provoke. The Grand Master, reportedly furious, accepted the swords, adding them to his own, and ordered his army to advance. It's one of those moments that sounds like something out of a cheesy historical drama, but it genuinely happened, setting a tense, pride-driven tone for the slaughter that followed. The Battle of Grunwald was, simply put, a disaster for the Teutonic Order. It wasn't a quick skirmish, it was a brutal, hours-long meat grinder involving tens of thousands of soldiers. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, despite some initial setbacks, ultimately surrounded and annihilated much of the Order's army. Many of the Order's highest-ranking knights, including Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, and most of his senior commanders were killed on the field. A mainstream historical fact is that Grunwald is widely considered the largest battle in medieval Europe by number of combatants, and its outcome irrevocably broke the military power of the Teutonic Order. Imagine the news slowly trickling back to Malbork. The shock, the grief, the dawning realization of the catastrophe. The knights remaining in the castle, many of them older or administrative staff, suddenly found themselves facing the unthinkable. The Polish-Lithuanian army, though victorious, was also exhausted. After the battle, they marched towards Malbork, expecting the Order's capital to fall quickly. However, the newly elected Grand Master, Heinrich von Plauen, proved to be a capable and determined defender. He fortified the castle and prepared for a siege. You, if you were inside, would be living through a period of intense fear and hardship. The grandeur of feasts and diplomatic receptions would be replaced by rationing, constant watch duty on the walls, the terrifying sound of siege engines, and the sight of a massive enemy army camped outside your gates. Against all odds, Malbork held out. The siege, lasting several months, eventually failed due to lack of Polish-Lithuanian siege equipment and the onset of disease within their camp. So Malbork survived the immediate aftermath of Grunwald, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The Order was financially ruined, having lost its best fighters and needing to pay huge indemnities and ransoms for captured knights under the ensuing First Peace of Torun, 1411. Its military reputation was shattered. The mystique of the invincible Crusader state evaporated overnight. Internally, tensions flared between the remaining knights and the wealthy cities and gentry of Prussia, who had borne much of the financial burden of the war and felt the Order's rule was oppressive and ineffective. This wasn't a swift, clean death, but a slow, agonizing decline, punctuated by further conflicts. The ensuing decades saw more wars with Poland and Lithuania and increasing internal unrest within the Order's own territories. The cities and gentry, fed up with high taxes and arbitrary rule, formed a confederation against the Order, eventually appealing to the King of Poland for protection. This triggered the devastating 13 Years' War, 1454 to 1466. This war was even worse than Grunwald in terms of duration and economic impact. The Order, short on funds, even mortgaged parts of its territory, including Malbork Castle itself, to mercenaries who then refused to leave unless paid. Historians still argue whether the Order's defeat at Grunwald was the definitive turning point, or if their decline was inevitable due to their internal structure and external pressures, with Grunwald merely accelerating a process already in motion. Was their model of a militarized monastic state inherently unsustainable in the evolving political landscape of Europe? The ultimate blow came with the Second Peace of Torun in 1466. This treaty redrew the map completely. The Order was forced to cede a vast portion of its territory, including the strategically vital Pomerelia, the Vistula Delta, and the wealthy cities like Danzig, Gdansk, Torun, Thorn, and Elblung, to the Kingdom of Poland. This territory became known as Royal Prussia. Crucially, Malbork Castle was included in this cession. The Teutonic Order lost its capital and was forced to retreat east to Königsberg. So the castle that had been the proud heart of the Teutonic Knights' state, the symbol of their power and ambition, was no longer theirs. Its role changed overnight. It was no longer the seat of the Grand Master, the spiritual and administrative center of a vast territory ruled by warrior monks. Instead, it became one of the most important fortresses and royal residences within the Kingdom of Poland. You would see Polish officials arrive, Polish garrisons stationed within its walls. The Teutonic era had ended here, making way for a new chapter under different rulers. It was a monumental shift, leaving behind the echoes of crusading zeal and legendary origins for the practical realities of being a jewel in the crown of the Polish kings. So, the castle rises brick by painstaking brick, a monument to medieval ambition and organizational prowess. But lurking beneath the solid stone and soaring arches, woven into the very fabric of its legend, is the chilling tale that gives this whole bedtime story its delightfully unsettling name. The story of the 1,000+ human tongues buried beneath the foundations. It's the kind of detail that sticks with you, isn't it? Makes you look at ancient architecture a little differently. Like, sure, nice parapet, but did anyone have to donate a body part for it? Now let's address the elephant in the room, or perhaps the 1,000 severed tongues under the floorboards. This isn't exactly standard medieval building code. Requirement: 5 bricks, 3 barrels mortar, 1,000+ human tongues. No, that doesn't appear in any historical documents I've ever seen. The legend of the tongues is just that, a legend. It's a dark, potent, and frankly rather gruesome story that has attached itself to the castle over the centuries. It's not something you'll find confirmed in the order's meticulously kept financial ledgers or building records, which, by the way, were surprisingly detailed. They tracked everything from the cost of bricks to how much beer the workers drank. Priorities. Yet, despite the lack of concrete proof, the legend persists, circulating in local folklore, historical accounts, and even showing up in some older, less scholarly texts as a grim fact. Why tongues? Of all the potential sacrifices or grisly stories to attach to a mighty fortress, why this specific, deeply unsettling image? Tongues, historically and symbolically, are linked to speech, testimony, identity, and silence. To bury over 1,000 tongues could represent silencing a populace, erasing dissent, or perhaps even a macabre ritual sacrifice intended to bind the fortress to the land, or silence the voices of those who had been conquered or exploited to build it. Imagine the sheer horror of it, not just killing beside enemies, but taking meager monies. It's a level of brutality that transcends simple warfare and enters the realm of symbolic terror. It speaks to a fear of the power structure, a fear so profound it conjures images of physical mutilation as a means of control. It's certainly more memorable than they just worked people to death with dysentery, which was probably far more common but lacked that certain Gothic flair. One popular theory about the origin of this legend ties it directly to the relationship between the Teutonic Knights and the local populations they conquered or displaced. The order arrived in the region ostensibly to convert the pagan Prussians, but their methods were often brutal, involving military conquest and the establishment of a rigid, hierarchical state. The people living there before the Knights spoke different languages, had different customs, and different religious beliefs. The legend of the tongues could symbolize the systematic suppression of these native cultures and languages. Burying the tongues of over 1,000 people might represent the silencing of their stories, their history, their protests against the new order. It's a folk memory, perhaps, of the cultural and literal violence inflicted by the conquering power. It's a way for the memory of the subjugated to assert itself through a horrifying image, a counter-narrative to the official history written by the victors. It's the nightmare fuel version of history is written by the winners. Another interpretation connects the legend to the vast workforce used to build the castle. As mentioned earlier, this wasn't just knights with shovels. It was a massive labor force, likely including conscripted locals, prisoners of war, and hired laborers from various regions. These people would have spoken diverse languages and dialects, Prussian, Polish, German, perhaps others. Building such a colossal structure under harsh conditions, often with little pay and less freedom, would have bred discontent and resistance. The legend might be a distorted memory of the suppression of worker uprisings, protests, or attempts to communicate and organize resistance. Silencing the workforce, preventing them from speaking out or coordinating, would have been a priority for the order. The tongues in this context become a symbol of the silenced voices of the laborers whose lives were consumed by the project. It's the ultimate managerial nightmare, not just losing a few good men to the plague, but having your entire workforce literally rendered speechless by supernatural means or extreme violence. A mainstream historical fact that might inadvertently feed into such grim folklore is the reality of medieval conflict and conquest. Warfare was brutal, and conquering powers often sought to break the spirit of the subjugated population. Massacres, enslavement, enforced displacement were not uncommon tactics. While the legend of the tongues might be hyperbole, it reflects a historical reality of extreme violence and the deliberate dismantling of existing societal structures and identities by the conquering Teutonic Knights. They weren't known for their gentle approach to integration. It was more about conversion by sword and sermon, heavy on the sword part. This historical context makes the idea of such a gruesome act, even if not literally true, feel disturbingly plausible within the brutal logic of the era. Now, is there any physical evidence? Has anyone ever dug around the foundations and found a pile of ancient, desiccated tongues? No, absolutely not. Modern archaeological investigations have explored parts of the castle, but no such find has ever been reported. The soil beneath the castle yields pottery shards, coins, tools, and other artifacts of daily life and construction. But thankfully, no mass grave of severed tongues. This reinforces the idea that it's a story, not a historical event, a testament to the enduring power of folklore to express deep-seated fears and historical trauma. It's a psychological truth, if not a literal one. It tells us more about how the castle was perceived by some and how the order's rule was remembered than it does about the specifics of medieval waste disposal practices. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval folklore about building involves beliefs about foundation sacrifices. In various cultures and time periods, there are myths or legends about sacrificing animals or even humans to ensure the stability and longevity of important structures like bridges, walls, or buildings. These foundation sacrifices were often believed to appease spirits, ward off evil, or imbue the structure with strength. While the idea of burying tongues is specific and unusual, it could be a dark twist on this broader theme of foundation sacrifice, perhaps perverted by the specific context of conquest and suppression. Instead of sacrificing something to give the building life or protection, it's sacrificing a part of people to silence them and solidify control. It's foundation sacrifice with a side of political terror. Yeah, we're building a wall, just gotta bury this cat, and maybe silence a few hundred dissenters while we're at it. Standard procedure. Okay, definitely not standard procedure, but you get the dark vibe. Historians still argue whether legends like the Thousand Tongues are purely cautionary tales, reflecting anxieties about power and subjugation, or if they contain a kernel of distorted truth, exaggerating real but less gruesome events. Could it be that a smaller number of bodies were buried on site during construction? Perhaps victims of accidents, disease, or smaller acts of violence that were then amphibious and transformed by folklore over centuries into this horrific image? Or is the legend entirely symbolic, a pure expression of resistance through narrative, painting the oppressors in the darkest possible light? It's a debate about the nature of historical memory and the relationship between folklore and factual history. How does collective trauma get translated into stories? And where does the line between symbolic truth and literal falsehood lie? It's fertile ground for discussion, preferably not late at night when you're already trying to fall asleep, because severed tongues are definitely not conducive to peaceful slumber. Regardless of its factual basis or lack thereof, the legend of the tongues has become an intrinsic part of the castle's identity in the popular imagination. It adds a layer of dark romance and mystery to what is already an imposing historical site. It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names, it's also the stories people tell, the fears they hold, and the ways they remember hardship and injustice. It's the whisper in the dark that chills you more than any dry historical fact. And as you imagine the millions of bricks, the miles of scaffolding, the sheer human effort that went into building this place, the legend of the thousand silenced voices, makes you wonder just what kind of human cost truly lies buried beneath its colossal weight. It's a question that lingers long after the last stone was laid and the last brick was fired. A question that perhaps can only be answered in the realm of nightmares and folklore, not in the pages of history books. So, you've mentally explored the terrifying potential subsoil contents and acknowledged that history is perhaps more about grim folklore than verified horror under the floorboards. The castle is built. It stands. This colossal, silent witness to immense human effort and imagined darkness. But what was it for? Once the hammering stopped in the masonry set, what happened within these walls? After the stones were laid, the roofs were thatched or tiled, depending on the section, and the gatehouses stood ready. Well, the mainstream historical fact is that this isn't just a castle built by the Teutonic Knights. It becomes the castle. It becomes the administrative and military heart of their entire state, the seat of the Grand Master himself, and the bustling, powerful nerve center of the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia. Imagine walking through the main gate, not as a tourist today, but as someone approaching in, say, the late 14th century. You're not just seeing a fortress, you're seeing the capital of a powerful entity that controlled vast territories, rich trade routes, and wielded significant military and political influence across the Baltic region and beyond. This isn't just a military outpost, it's more like the Vatican City of its time, but with significantly more armor and less Renaissance art, unless you count beautifully illuminated manuscripts or intricate wood carvings. It was where decisions were made that affected the lives of thousands, where emissaries from kings and popes were received, where vast sums of money changed hands, and where the next military campaign was plotted. Life inside these walls was incredibly complex and far from the simple monastic ideal the order theoretically espoused. You had the knights, of course, the warrior monks, ostensibly dedicated to fighting pagans and living simply, though by this point, many were more akin to military aristocrats running a complex state economy. But alongside them were hundreds, perhaps thousands of others, priests to handle the spiritual needs in the vast libraries and archives, servants to cook, clean, and maintain the sprawling complex, craftsmen of every description, blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors, cobblers, armorers, keeping the machine running, administrators, scribes, and treasurers managing the order's immense wealth and extensive land holdings. Even medical staff, though medieval medicine might make you wish you just stuck with the dysentery. It was a miniature city, all contained within the formidable walls you helped imagine building. The sheer logistics of feeding, housing, and managing this population within the castle were astounding. Think about the kitchens, not just a pot over a fire, but massive operations capable of feeding hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 people daily. Storerooms piled high with grain, smoked meats, dried fish, and barrels of beer and wine. Medieval hydration was heavily reliant on alcoholic beverages, which honestly makes a lot of historical decisions slightly more understandable. There were stables for hundreds of horses, necessary for both war and transportation. Workshops clanging with the sound of hammers on metal, the smell of tanning hides, the constant hum of activity. It was a place buzzing with purpose, despite its imposing, stone-faced exterior. This wasn't a silent, austere monastery. It was a hub of power and wealth. The order controlled trade, particularly the lucrative amber trade from the Baltic coast. Imagine ships arriving at nearby ports, their goods destined for the order's storehouses, eventually to be traded across Europe, funding their military ventures and their lavish building projects. The castle effectively functioned as a massive bank and a trading post, alongside its military and administrative roles. You could argue it was one of the most powerful corporate headquarters of its time, just branded with a cross instead of a catchy logo. One quirky or fringe tidbit about life in the castle relates to their internal hierarchy and customs. The Teutonic Knights had incredibly detailed rules and regulations governing everything from how they dressed to how they ate to when they were allowed to speak. For example, during meals in the refectory, silence was often observed while a portion of scripture or the order's rules was read aloud. And while they were warrior monks, they weren't necessarily living in squalor. Archaeological finds suggest a surprising level of comfort and even luxury for the higher-ranking knights. Heated rooms, imported goods, relatively varied diets compared to the average peasant. It wasn't quite glamping, but it was a far cry from a hermit's cave. It's like joining the army and finding out your barracks have underfloor heating and a decent wine list. Historians still argue whether the order's increasing focus on state administration and economic power, as centered in this very castle, ultimately corrupted their original crusading mission. Did the wealth and temporal power based here in Malbork distract them from their spiritual goals or the evangelization they supposedly came for? Or was building a stable, prosperous state seen as a necessary prerequisite for defending Christendom and furthering the faith in the region? It's a debate about priorities. Did the means, building a powerful state, overshadow the ends, spiritual conversion? Or were they two sides of the same medieval coin? Looking at the sheer scale of this fortress, it's hard not to feel that earthly power became a significant, perhaps dominant part of their purpose. As you mentally wander these courtyards and halls, you can almost hear the echoes, the clatter of boots on stone, the murmur of Latin prayers, the shouts of German commands, the polyglot chatter of servants and laborers, the neighing of horses, the ringing of bells. It's a vibrant, intense soundscape overlaying the silent stone. Remember that feeling of the legend of the tongues from the last section? This bustling life coexists with that dark folklore, a stark contrast between the official, powerful reality and the submerged, fearful stories of the subjugated. The Order built its gleaming, efficient machine, but the whispers of its human cost lingered outside the official records. Imagine the Grand Master's palace within the complex. Not just a Spartan room, but a lavish residence befitting a near-sovereign ruler. Great halls for banquets and receiving ambassadors, private chapels, comfortable chambers. This was no longer just a monastic order. It was a royal court of sorts, holding sway from this immense stone throne. The castle wasn't just a place of work, it was a place of high politics, diplomacy, and the projection of power. Every stone, every tower, every gate was designed to impress, intimidate, and assert dominance. It was medieval branding at its most effective. This incredible fortress, built with such effort and surrounding itself with such potent, dark legends, truly became the heart of the Teutonic Knights' world for a significant period. It shaped their identity, facilitated their power, and stood as the ultimate symbol of their presence in the region. From this central point, they governed, they traded, they planned, and they projected their will. It's a history etched in stone, layered with the stories of those who lived, worked, conquered, and perhaps were silenced within or beneath its formidable shadow. So you've stood in the imagined courtyards, felt the pulse of this immense, powerful entity, built from stone and ambition, layered with dark whispers of its foundation. For decades, this castle, this Malbork, stood as an almost invincible symbol of the Teutonic Knights' dominance. It was their capital, their stronghold, their pride. But history, as you're probably starting to realize, rarely allows anyone to stay on top forever, especially medieval militaristic monastic orders who got a bit too comfortable with their power. The wheel of fortune, or maybe just regional politics and changing military technology, inevitably turned. The mainstream historical fact here is that the seemingly unassailable power centered in this castle faced a catastrophic challenge in 1410 with the Battle of Grunwald, or Tannenberg, depending on which side of the history books you're reading. This wasn't a skirmish, it was one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages, pitting the forces of the Teutonic Order against the combined armies of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The outcome was devastating for the Order. Their Grand Master was killed, many of their leading knights fell, and their military strength was crippled. Suddenly, the aura of invincibility surrounding the Order and its capital fortress was shattered. While the castle itself wasn't taken immediately after the battle, it famously withstood a subsequent siege in 1410. The defeat at Grunwald marked the beginning of a long, slow decline for the Teutonic state. Think of it like a company that loses its charismatic, indispensable CEO and half its executive team in a single terrible merger gone wrong. The infrastructure is still there, the buildings stand, but the dynamic, the confidence, the strategic direction, it's fundamentally broken. The castle remained the seat of the Grand Master for a while longer, but its significance gradually diminished as the Order's territory shrank and its influence waned. Internal strife, economic problems, and further military defeats against the Polish crown chipped away at their state. This magnificent fortress, built as a beacon of power and spiritual purpose, questionable spiritual purpose, perhaps, given the tongue thing, started to feel less like a vibrant capital and more like a beleaguered headquarters trying to hold on to a shrinking empire. It's like having the most impressive office building in the world, but all your major clients have left and you're mostly just rearranging furniture. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this later period involves the castle's transfer of ownership. Despite its formidable defenses, Malbork wasn't ultimately conquered by force by the Polish-Lithuanian alliance. Instead, it was sold. During the 13 Years' War, 1454 to 1466, which was another protracted conflict between the Order and the Polish crown, the castle garrison, largely composed of mercenaries who hadn't been paid by the cash-strapped Order for a while. Seriously, unpaid mercenaries are the worst kind of medieval HR nightmare. Simply sold the fortress to the Polish king, Casimir IV Jagiellon. Imagine building something so huge and symbolic, only for your disgruntled staff to hand the keys over for a payday. A rather ignominious end for the capital of such a proud, powerful state. Historians still argue whether the sale of Malbork Castle in 1457 was the real nail in the coffin for the Teutonic state's independence, or merely a highly symbolic consequence of a decline that was already irreversible. Had the order been financially stable and able to pay its troops, would the castle have held out and prolonged their state's existence significantly? Or was the strategic and political landscape of the Baltic already shifted so decisively that the loss of the castle, however it happened, was merely a matter of time before the order became a vassal of Poland? It's a classic chicken or the egg debate about whether financial collapse caused the military political failure, or if the military political failures simply led to the financial collapse. After it came under Polish control, the castle served in various capacities for centuries. It became a royal residence, a base for Polish kings visiting the region, a military storehouse, and administrative center. It was damaged and repaired multiple times during various wars, its original Teutonic character sometimes obscured by later additions and modifications. It was no longer the exclusive, sealed-off world of the warrior monks, but became integrated, albeit as a very important structure, into the broader life and history of Poland. Thinking back to the legend of the tongues, you might wonder what happened to those stories, or that perceived foundation of sacrifice and subjugation once the Teutonic Order was gone. Did the legends fade? Were they reinterpreted? The castle stood, a monument to the Order's presence, but also a place with a long memory etched into its stones and perhaps, metaphorically, into the soil beneath. The shift in ownership didn't erase the past, but it layered new histories, new uses, and new meanings on top of the old ones. The castle suffered significantly over the centuries, particularly during the Swedish deluge in the mid-17th century and later during the Napoleonic era. Parts fell into disrepair. Some sections were even used as barracks or storehouses in a rather utilitarian manner that ignored their historical significance. Imagine priceless medieval carvings being used to prop up supply shelves. Makes you wince, doesn't it? It wasn't until the 19th century, during the Romantic era's renewed interest in medieval history, that serious efforts began to restore the castle to its former glory. This was a massive undertaking, a historical and architectural puzzle involving complex decisions about which historical layer to prioritize during restoration. Today, the castle is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a colossal museum that attracts visitors from around the globe. You can walk through the very halls, courtyards, and chapels you've imagined for the last hour or so. The sheer scale is still breathtaking. The history feels incredibly present, a tangible connection to those distant centuries of crusading, state building, conflict, and legend. Standing there, or imagining standing there, you see the culmination of that immense effort, the ultimate fate of the power that built it, and the layers of time that have accumulated. From the ambition that drove its construction, fueled perhaps by dark deeds and hidden costs, to its peak as a powerful capital, through its decline and eventual sale, its damage and restoration, the castle is a testament to the long, complex, and often surprising journey of historical sites. And who knows what other stories, what other whispers might still be hidden within its walls, beneath its stones, or deep in the collective memory of the land it dominates. Okay, the journey through Malbork Castle and its rather grounded legend is reaching its close. You've walked the imaginary ramparts, peered into the historical records, and maybe even felt a slight shiver, contemplating what might lie beneath. Now, as the images of massive stone walls, bustling medieval life, and the quiet passage of centuries begin to settle, let your mind drift away from the specifics. Let the weight of the history lift gently. The stones remain, the stories persist in their own way, but your task for tonight is simply to relax. Breathe in slowly, then let the breath go, releasing any lingering thoughts of Crusader knights or unfortunate foundational elements. The castle stands, silent now in the quiet of the night, a distant echo in the historical landscape. There's nothing more to figure out, nothing more to see or do right now. Just be. Feel the support beneath you, the stillness around you. Allow the sounds of the night, whatever they may be, to blend into a soft, comforting rhythm. Let the day's concerns, like those distant historical conflicts, fade into the background, becoming less and less important as sleep approaches. Your mind is clear, your body is heavy and relaxed. There's just the gentle hum of quiet leading you deeper into rest. You did great exploring this little corner of the past. Now it's time to simply let go. Sleep well.